Welcome to the Industrial IoT Spotlight, your number one spot for insight from industrial IoT thought leaders who are transforming businesses today. With your host, Erik Walenza.
Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Erik Walenza, CEO of IoT One, the consultancy that helps companies create value from data to accelerate growth. And our guest today is Jan Burian, Associate Vice President and Head of IDC Manufacturing Insights EMEA. IDC helps IT professionals, business executives, and the investment community make fact-based decisions about technology purchases and business strategy. In this talk, we discuss the architecture of the industrial metaverse and how companies are steadily building it out, one technology and one use case at a time. We also explored how generative AI can be used in industrial environments, including as a user interface for the industrial metaverse to help navigate data overload. If you find these conversations valuable, please leave us a comment and a 5-star review. And if you'd like to share your company's story or recommend a speaker, you can email us at team@iot1.com. Finally, if you have an IoT research, strategy, or innovation initiative that you'd like to discuss, please email me directly at erik.walenza@iot1.com. Thank you. Jan, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you. Hi, Erik. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I'm really looking forward to this. I know that you've listened to some of our podcasts, so you know that we mostly are interviewing CXOs of younger tech companies or executives of more mature tech companies. But now I have the luxury of interviewing somebody who talks as an analyst, every day. So, yeah, really looking forward to digging into a couple quite challenging topics with you. Thanks for joining.
I'm actually a huge fan of your podcast show because, it's like a huge source of not just like information, but inspiration for my work, right? So every time I just listen to that, not every time, but when I listen to that, I got so many ideas that I would like to put them on a paper, and write a comment to that and to publish it somewhere. And this is actually how I started my publishing work because I do write a lot of thought leadership or opinion pieces, and which I publish like everywhere around the world. And again, IoT podcast is for me a huge source of inspiration. So thank you for that.
Cool. No, I'm glad to hear that. For me, it's likewise a great source of inspiration and an education, just hosting the podcast. And I think today will be no difference for me. So we're going to be discussing industrial metaverse, which I think is a fascinating topic because it's a topic, if you ask 10 people around a table, what is industrial metaverse? You would get 10 different responses, right? And so just defining the tech stack alone is challenging, defining the use cases, figuring out how this fits into a business. So really looking forward to getting into the topic with you. And let's start simple. So if you were to give a 60-second pitch of here's industrial metaverse, what would that pitch look like?
All right, start right away. So, the way we define it in IDC, but we're pretty much in line with the other tech companies, is that industrial metaverse is a highly immersive future environment that blends the physical and digital to enable a shared sort of sense, presence, interaction, continuity across the multiple domains, engineering, operations, supply chain. But that you can actually understand it as a sort of digital twin, right? Complex digital twin. But there's also that perspective of immersive environment, right? Super or hyper realistic, right? And this is something which makes it different from, I would say, classic digital twin. And there's also the difference between the gaming or social metaverse, which is really like a totally, let's say, digital environment, right? But industrial metaverse is something which is really connected to the real world, right? Leveraging the data from a real world. And we can also look at it as a sort of like a time machine, right? Where you can fast forward or going forwards or backwards in time, and try to analyze the situations. You can, or the user can also say, test the environment, right? Doing the simulations. So this is what's very different from a classic metaverse. And so you're right? Back to your first sentence. 10 people would understand industrial metaverse in 10 different ways, but that's the definition we try to stick to, right? So really like immersive environment that blends physical and digital.
So if I break that down into more discrete technologies. You could say that the industrial metaverse, it's built on a network of sensors that are collecting real-time data that are then integrated into some kind of platform that integrates those different data flows. And traditionally, you might just look at that as a digital twin through your laptop. So kind of a traditional digital twin application. But then the industrial metaverse would also include an enhanced front end, an enhanced user experience where you're not just accessing this through your laptop, but as you walk through the day in different ways, you are able to interact with that data landscape. And then the third element would be the AI element, where because you have this kind of this digital twin, you're able to predict activities going forward in time. You're able to understand why an activity happened in the past by processing data. And is that kind of a reasonable way to think about the technologies? So kind of the sensor, platform, enhanced user interface, which I guess could be a few things, and then AI?
Yeah, I mean, when I think the industry metaverse, I maybe start with the platform first, right? Because it's not just like about the data coming from the machines or coming from the production assets, but it's also the, I would say, environment where the data from a different software could come in, right? So from ERP, PLM, you name it, right? But that's another thing. But also there could be also the data coming from the, I would say, outside the company. So one of the biggest benefits of such a platform is the real contextualization of the data, right? So you can really contextualize it, right? So that's, I would really start with the platform first, visualization of what's on the platform, and then the different, let's say, data streams, bringing the data into that platform. And from a, I would say, visualization point of view, that's, I mean, it could be also the AR, VR technology, but at this point, it's probably not that super important, right? Because you can use just like a screen of your laptop. That's not a big thing, right? So maybe in the future, it's gonna move somewhere into the sort of like a semi-virtual or let's say AR, VR environment. But now to really leverage the power of industrial metaverse, even now, you don't need to have it at the moment, right?
Let me better understand. It sounds like this could to some extent be viewed as a rebranding of an existing technology, which is, basically a data platform with some simulation capabilities, kind of digital twin capabilities that maybe existed 10 years ago. And of course, it's grown more sophisticated. But why do we need the term metaverse? Why not just say it's a digital twin and we keep making incremental improvements on that so that you can access data in more ways and have more data sets integrated and so forth?
Yeah, because it's also about just like a collaboration as well, right? So I mean, you're right that a certain part could be more like it's really like a virtual immersive digital twin, and the digital twins are with us, I mean, for quite time already. Then there's that, I would say, the element of that hyper realistic visualization, something what NVIDIA is providing mostly, right, to these use cases like that BMW virtual factory, right? So without that, it's like a twin, right? So I mean, my experience with the digital twin was always that it doesn't have to be like a visually appealing thing, right? So it could be just like I don't know, it could be just like the data could be output of that, right? And personally, and I'm a person who was working or starting career in a factories, right? So that visualization always played quite an important, I would say, element in a way, or the employee experience. The people were adapting the technology, right? So then this is what I also see, that the visual part is also very important, and it wasn't that, I would say, necessary part of the digital twin, let's say, before, right? So for me, industrial metaverse is really the platform, digital twin, enhanced with that visual perspective. And the other thing is that also that place for collaboration or for trainings, right? So it's, I would say, digital twin plus, right? Or someone call it like digital twin on steroids, right? So which is actually true, right? But that's a current status, right? Or current situation. What's gonna come in the future? We can maybe touch upon that a little bit later.
Yeah, well, let's get into then the users and the use cases, because I think that's where it then gets a little bit more concrete. So I think that's a good point. If you think about a traditional digital twin, the user is going to be a fairly well-trained analyst of some sort, or like an engineer that has a high degree of understanding of the system. And it's going to have often a fairly small number of users who are really kind of understand the system and interact with it. Does that change significantly now? So are we talking about then the kind of extending the touch points where you have a much wider range of people who are interacting on a regular basis with the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is a sort of really like a virtual representative of the real world, right? Then, I mean, almost like the number of users could equal the number of the people being part of the daily processes in a factory. Let's put it like that, right? So, production planning, simulations, shop floor engineers, quality managers, I would say maintenance stuff, right? So everybody could get their own, let's say, part inside that industrial metaverse, right? So they can leverage the data, contextualize the data, as I already mentioned before, right? So it's sort of like a time machine. So they can also try to understand, I mean, some consequences of something would happen on a shop floor, right? So that's practically sort of like a parallel world to their physical environment, right? So and then, of course, with that, the number of use cases could be probably expanding. I mean, the more open this world, the line of businesses are going to be, and that's the future, right? So, and this is just when you think about within the four walls, right? If you go outside the factory itself or company, then you can think supply chain, right? So, or the entire like a value chains, right? So that could be connections to your customers and also to the suppliers, right? It could be connection to the, let's say, third party participants like a service providers, right? Or the servicing companies, right? So I would say, I think that once you get out of this, let's say, really like a four walls, I mean, you can get to almost, you can really exponentially expand for the number of use cases.
Mm. Yeah, well, that's interesting, actually. I mean, you mentioned maintenance. I was talking with a elevator company last week, and one of the cases they were looking at was basically, they have SAP, and then in Germany they have kind of a manager of a maintenance team. And you can imagine elevator maintenance; it's a big part of their business. It can be fairly complicated when things shift. And this guy, in Germany, he logs onto their SAP integrated solution in the morning, and he adjusts schedules and so forth based on the data he sees. In China, that doesn't happen. In China, you have turnover every 18 months, so you don't properly train people. The guys have, they have a high school degree, they don't use laptops. And so then we were discussing, okay, why not have, just a mobile app, use AI behind it to do most of the scheduling, and then you're just kind of telling this person, here's what the system suggests you do, anything that is not going to work here. So you have a lot of automation built into this. So on the one hand, you are really greatly simplifying the solution, and you're making it so that a maintenance engineer, a maintenance manager with a low degree of education can use this. On the other hand, you're putting the technology behind the scenes in terms of the AI and so forth, so that it can actually do, a fairly sophisticated job of scheduling. And so that sounds like it's starting to move, and that would just be one touch point, right? But I guess if you multiply that by 500 use cases, then and you start looking at the data streams flowing into each other, is that start to build up into then kind of the system that you would imagine as an enterprise that's properly connected, or connecting the people on the ground, the people that are doing operations back with with systems as far up the stack as SAP.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is definitely going to be a future, right? So it's gonna maybe take a while to get there and to also connect these, let's say, single use cases into sort of something like a bigger world, let's put it like that, right? Because in my understanding of the future, this is really like a parallel world to our real world, right? So like you walk on a street and you get to the factory, you go through the doors, walk in, take a look, on everything around, like in a real life. In a far future, maybe also you could be also doing this in a virtual world, right? And you can see the environment in a real time. Of course, there should be some sort of like a security barriers, right, or cybersecurity element must be embedded in this, right? But that's how I think about the future, right? So it's really like a parallel world, right? So if these the services, you say like elevators, could be cars, could be machines, could be assets in the factories, could be Oryx, whatever. One day it's gonna be really like a digital twin of the enterprise world, but this is gonna take, I mean, maybe a decades, right? So it's definitely nothing that is gonna happen, say, in a couple of years. But generally speaking, what's also very important here is that a scalability element. right? Like, there are already some companies which are already try to building the factories in a virtual environment first, right? And use that industrial metaverse environment for simulations and for, I would say, for scaling the factories. I mean, in a rapid tempo, right, around the world, right? Especially environments like electric battery production, right, which is very new thing. It's industrial on its own, right? So could be also now very competitive. So it's very important to really scale fast. So this is where this sort of like a tool could help.
Yeah, if you look at the early movers here, is it like I mean, you mentioned EV battery production. Is it process manufacturing? I guess that strikes me as the market that has the most sophisticated digital twins just as a foundation because they're managing very heavy manufacturing processes where downtime is highly impactful. But would they be the big first adopters, or are there other groups that you look to when you want to see yeah?
Yeah, I think that these are more, I mean, rather than process, these are more, let's say, like discrete manufacturers, mostly the ones with the complicated engineering products. But typically, the earliest adopters of, I would say, most of these digital technologies is the automotive industry, right? Car makers, car OEMs. This is where the most innovation are being tested, and they are far ahead of the others. Then the electric battery business, but that sort of also could be seen as a part of the automotive, right? From a process industries, that would be mostly the food and bev, right? So we saw some sort of like a virtual factories or breweries, for example, right? So I would say, this is really like environment which is really with the, I would say, high speed production. So also that I would say 100% control over the process, having the digital twin of the process of the entire production plant is really bringing those super benefits, right? Because every stop there, I mean, is causing big issues in their supply chains or into their value chains, right? So these are probably the automotive and I would say FMCG, but mostly food and bev, right? These are the earliest adapters.
Yeah, gotcha. So if we think about then what it takes to adopt, I mean, obviously there's a lot of technology that needs to be adopted. So there's a certain challenge inherent there just in making decisions, in budgeting, in implementation, and so forth. I guess there's also kind of cultural challenges because you're then looking at maybe changing how a lot of business processes run. You're providing visibility into areas of the operations where there wasn't visibility before, which some people will react negatively to. What do you see as the main challenges, the main barriers to adoption?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty much the same if you look at the adoption of digital technologies in general, right? So for many companies, I mean, if they are, let's say, if they are like a brownfield, right? So they have their technology working in silos, right? So they don't have a data ready or data infrastructure, or even like generally speaking, the actual infrastructure ready for these type of projects. And what's also interesting that I would say this sort of like a paradox, right? Like some companies, on the other hand, they implemented so many digital tools or solutions, but they kept them running in silos, right? So the more digital they were, I mean, and they had that feeling that we are here with digital, I mean, we're fully digital, we're already transformed, but the more silo they created, right? So at the end of the day, they were not able to really benefit fully from the power of the data, right? From the contextualization of the data. So this is what I see as one of the biggest barrier. So the way of people are thinking about the data infrastructure itself, about how the data should be managed or say should be processed. And then next, another step is the way how to really turn the data into the insights, because that's what counts, right? That's what's impacting the performance of the company the most, right? The ability of decision making based on the data. Again, so infrastructure, the way the people think about it. So I mean, if you look at some IDC survey outputs, right? So I would say the sort of like a limited knowledge of what to do with technology is always among, let's say, top 3, 5 barriers. Of course, a lot of companies are also thinking of sort of like not just being afraid, right? But one of their, let's say, like a sort of internal barrier in adoption of this digital technology would be the concerns about the cybersecurity. Maybe some companies are even, let's say, they are I understand that this is element, especially right now, where the even manufacturing is becoming a critical infrastructure. But maybe sometimes that's an element which is really slowing down the adoption of some technology in a companies, especially when it comes. We talk a lot about that IT OT integration. Then while IT was, let's say, for a long time, it was let's say the environment where the cybersecurity rules and technologies were applied. The OT was left behind, right, for some time. So now, when it's everything online, internet, I probably heard that lots of many times. I mean, speaking to your guest on a podcast, right? But that's in reality, this is also one of the key barriers, right? The IT OT integration and the way the data has been transferred, and also the security aspects being a part of this challenge.
Yeah, I know it's funny. Probably 40 years ago, if you were talking about a new technology, it would be the military or the kind of Fortune 500 companies that were running it, rolling it out soonest. And now the challenge you have with this concept of industrial metaverse is people think of meta, right? So they think of basically a consumer e-commerce on but the consumer just moves a lot faster in terms of adoption now. Although I guess they're hitting some speed bumps.
Yeah, exactly. Because that was actually the reason I started writing the articles about industrial metaverse. Because I mean, when I visited some like a conference or some, let's say, tech focused event, I had a feeling that it was, I would say, that this concept was misunderstood, right, or a misinterpretation of this term or of the entire concept. So, and that was why I started thinking about it and then talking to the vendors, the leaders in this area. But also, it's not just about like let's say like a software technology providers. It's also about the hyperscalers, right? I mean, to understand, I mean, whether this is something they see as a technology which they believe in, right? So because they are, at the end of the day, they are the ones who are really providing that infrastructure, right, to the platforms. You can have, let's say, many platforms, but when it comes to the data centers, that's not so many players on the market, right? So that was the reason why, right? So as you said at the beginning, 10 different opinions or 10 different understandings.
There's one other topic here I wanted to touch on you with this, which is the topic of environmental sustainability as kind of a cluster of use cases. I know you've wrote an article recently on the topic. So why is this industrial metaverse tech stack particularly useful for addressing the topic of environmental sustainability?
Yeah, it depends on the angle, right? But generally speaking, I mean, such a virtual environment helps you to, I would say, reduce the number of sort of like interactions or activities in a real world, right? Which is at the end effect, it saves, it's reducing the carbon emissions, right? So you don't have to travel that much. You can share information. If you test something, you don't have to create the physical prototype, right? So you can do everything in a virtual environment. When you test the new factory, right? So you can do or start simulations in a virtual environment using the industrial metaverse sort of as also like a collaboration platform. So this would be probably the direct impact on that sustainability element. The next thing is, if you understand the industrial metaverse more in a broader concept, then, for example, in supply chain, right, it helps to get a better control over the supply chains, right? So you can, and what's also important here is that maybe there's going to be maybe some, let's say, sneak peek into the future, but this is not just about understanding the CO2 footprint of your supply chain and getting this information through the metaverse into your systems, but in the end, in fact, it should be also the tool through which you can actively control or manage the carbon footprint, right, or carbon emissions. Because one thing is just to have the reporting, the other is to really be able to manage that, to actively reduce it, right? So these are probably just a different discipline behind this, but this is where the industrial metaverse definitely could be like a powerful tool.
Yeah, it seems like this drive to understand your own carbon emissions and also the emissions of your supply chain seems to be driving a lot of effort to connect your facilities and to connect data streams between companies, right? Which you could say doesn't necessarily have to end up in being kind of a metaverse type of solution, but it certainly provides a lot more data that previously companies were not really incentivized to collect, such as, okay, we want to discreetly know each machine, how much electricity it's using, or at least each production line, so we can compare them. And we want to know what our supply chains look like and where materials were sourced and how much energy our suppliers are using and so forth. And so that provides a lot of data into the system that can then also be repurposed and
Yeah.
used for other analysis.
And it could be also seen as I would say, the environment where the closed loop information is being available, and that also in an environment where the product could be tracked, during its entire lifetime or life cycle. So that's also very important, because I would say the one thing is there's a one perspective that's a reduction of CO2 or carbon emissions, right? But on the other hand, the circularity also plays a big role there, right? Because probably the most efficient product is the one you don't have to produce, in terms of relation to the CO2 emissions. So that's something which could be also, I would say that industrial metaverse is really like a complex digital twin of the entire environment, right? So, and that's probably its biggest benefit, because, and you also said that at the beginning of this podcast, right? But there are so many technologies even now which you can apply to the certain areas of manufacturer's life, let's say, or of the life cycle of the product. This is so complex that you're not just able to control everything by separate tools. It's almost impossible. The complexity is really rising. So having the one single environment, one environment with all the information, this might be also beneficial for the users. And this is also where the data are being just stored, just processed, but also then it enables you to apply that in the artificial intelligence, right? Because you have to have a data in place, some governance in place, right? So that's a perfect environment for leveraging the power of AI.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. So, our focus here is on industrial metaverse, but I also want to pick your brain quickly on generative AI since you're on the line here. So, generative AI, I guess our listeners are going to be fairly familiar with it, but mostly from either a consumer application or maybe kind of a white collar office, so helping to draft documents for office work or so forth. If we look at an industrial environment, then I think we start to encounter a lot of challenges in terms of getting access to proprietary data and so forth, or issues with requiring more or less 100% reliability for the responses and so forth. What do you see today in terms of adoption of generative AI in solutions that are used in an industrial environment?
If I abstract from the, let's say, the marketing, HR, and these generic functions, then stick really to engineering, production, quality, maintenance, right? So we see that even if the companies themselves are trying to, let's say, understand the technology and try to think about the use cases, the case is that, of course, if they use some, let's say, like a ChatGPT, for example, right? So it's like this is not a proprietary technology for them, right? So what we see that number of IT vendors, or they're already starting, some of them started to embed these models into their tools or solutions, right? So like in PLM, for example. So this technology could be seen more as a sort of, where I can see the biggest potential are these, let's say, co-pilots. So helping people to, I would say, or enhancing the workers, engineers with the information, right? So coming from that complex environment, for example. So co-pilots, definitely. By the way, co-pilots also could help to tackle the workforce shortage in some areas, in some positions, right? Because you don't need to have that super skilled worker or super skilled engineer or super trained engineer, right? So you can have let's say, sort of like a newcomer. I wrote an article about this, right? So there was one company in their service department that were able to work also with more junior engineers who were enhanced with this information coming from this, let's say, sort of co-pilots, right? So co-pilot solutions. So this definitely help to improve or increase the productivity in certain areas. The next thing would be, and this is also what we see, that some companies, they're already testing that. For the, let's say, like writing the codes, right? So that's something that is quite straightforward thing. But also we see that some technology vendors are trying to enhance their solutions in terms of creating sort of like autonomous systems. For example, on a robotic line, if some issues happens, or be some most likely issue, right? So then the system could automatically change or reprogram the robot. So, and this is where the Gen AI could help significantly. Next thing, and this is what I think is more generic, I think that these language models, they also democratize the knowledge. You can have like an expert somewhere in, I don't know, in Asia, and you have a factory, I don't know, in South America, and you have really like, there could be sort of like a language barrier, right? So, and this is, it looks obvious, but in a real life, and as I said, right, I started my career in factories, and we had those problems all the times, like, having some issues like in one plant, and we need to talk to some supplier or to the machine builder in the other part of the world, and there was significant language barrier, for example. So now with these models, you can really have maybe the next step, this could be all done autonomously, but now you can have also sort of like a real, like a very intuitive, let's say like a translator, right? I mean, between those type of people. So it's really something I would really call like a real, like a democratization of the information, right? So, and this could be also the part of the metaverse, or could be part of the different tools, right? That the people could interact now in a more effective ways, if they are not, let's say, being replaced by the technology itself, but then it's a different story. But if there's still like a, say, person-to-person interaction, this is where the Gen AI could help significantly as well.
Yeah, certainly a person-to-person interaction, but this issue of data overload, right? If you really have a connected enterprise and you have a tremendous amount of information in there, any individual trying to figure out where's the right information, put it in the right format for me, make sure I'm not missing something, help me expand upon this if I need to be, I mean, that's a massive challenge, right? And it's really hard to address that challenge with traditional user interfaces of kind of scrolling through boxes and drop downs and so forth, right? I mean, you just have more or less infinite number of options once you get into these really deep systems. And so if you can have an AI that can give it a request and it tracks down the right thing, and you tell it how you want to look at the data and it presents it in the way that makes sense for you, yeah, I could see that as being a huge UX improvement just alone as a way to interface with metaverse systems. Jan, I think we covered a lot here on the metaverse. Anything we haven't touched on that is important for folks to understand?
Yeah, I mean, our conversation was touching the sort of, let's say, emerging technologies, right? Something which is super new, it's constantly developing. And I mean, for many people working in the daily operations, this might seem also very confusing. I mean, they might be having the sort of like a feeling that it's too much, right? Because like Industry 4.0, right? So that was like 12 years ago started, right? These conversations. During the times until today, I mean, there are so many new technology coming to those people working in operations. I'm not talking about people in IT, right? But people like in production, quality management, but also CIOs, but also like or CEOs, right? So everyone who actively works with technology, I mean, they have to deal with terms like a cloud, like artificial intelligence, and so on. And those cycles are probably shorter and shorter, right? Because I mean, we talk about industry metaverse now, we talk about the generative AI, maybe we're gonna talk about the quantum computing right soon, right? So I think it's very important to find a way how we as a people, and also the people working in technologies, benefit from those technologies, understand how to benefit from those technologies and how not to get lost in these, let's say, new tech, new terms. I mean, because once you can get to the point that you could just say, all right, I'm just giving up, I can stick to this technology. This is very late. I would like to go to understand, and then the rest is something super futuristic, and maybe it might be good for me, but I'm overloaded. You know what I mean? So this is the outside of thoughts I'm having in my head, right, on my mind. I mean, how to deal with that. I don't have actually the answer, right? But the point is that the organizations should be really having someone like, I really like that term of sort of like a chief future officer, but more in terms of the like a person who is, or person or environment, whatever, right? Or someone who's really tracking those, let's say, new things and putting them together in context with I would say, business and society trends, right? And turns those into I would say, sort of like a snackable information, sort of like a normal people, So that's very important.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, technology development cycles are getting more rapid, and we as apes are not getting, more sophisticated, at least not at the same pace as our technology is, right? So we have to find new systems that allow us to cope with that complexity. Well, Jan, thanks a lot for joining us on the podcast. Really enjoyed the talk with you today.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at IoT1HQ and to check out our database of case studies on IoT1.com. If you have unique insight or a project deployment story to share, we'd love to feature you on a future edition. Write us at eric.walenza@iot1.com.